Let's talk about hip flexor tightness. We're going to go over kind of why things can be tight, and then 3 of the exercises that I personally love to give my patients, my clients also, to help them work through this process, change their movement patterns, and also strengthen the corresponding muscles that cause your hip flexor tightness, as well as strengthening up your hip flexors. Let's pop into it, and we're going to go over all of these things. So as it comes to our hip flexors, we look at where they attach and what they want to do. They want to raise your leg up. They want to have a stable base to pull from. So our hip flexors connect from our spine, our pelvis area, and then go down and attach to our femur. These 3 muscles, our psoas, our iliacus, and also our rectus femoris. The rectus femoris you probably don't hear about as much. It's part of your quadricep muscle, and it's the only part of that 4 group of muscle, quad, that crosses over the hip. But it plays a huge role in your hip flexor tightness. And so as we think about attachment and insertion, or origin and insertion, we need to think about where's our stable base that we're pulling from. So if I'm going to raise up my arm, if I'm going to bend my elbow, then my bicep attachment point up in my shoulder region needs to be pretty stable for me to do this. If I'm doing both this, then now my bicep has to work a whole lot harder because multiple things are changing and my bicep has to control that. And so even just now, as you're watching, do a couple just bicep curls. Feel you can probably go for days with that. And now I want you to go up as you're doing it and feel how your bicep, now it's not going to be like I'm going to dry and I'm just like so fatigued out, but feel how much more it fatigues. And it's because it's changing in multiple places, because it not only crosses the elbow, it crosses the shoulder as well. Same thing happens with our hip, is that if we don't have a solid base, core, then our pelvis and our spine will start moving and shifting as we're trying to raise our leg, as we're trying to flex our hip. This causes our hip flexors to have to work so much more to do the same movement pattern that if we actually had a stronger core, and I'm talking more lower specific core, because we are controlling our pelvis and our lowermost part of our spine, then our hip flexors are going to have to work a whole lot more. This brings us to our first exercise, where we work on the relationship between our core and our hip flexors. It's called a marching exercise. And so you're going to be on your back. You're going to tuck your pelvis back so your back presses against the floor. If your back can't press all the way against the floor, put a towel up underneath the small of your back and press into that. Basically, it's making sure that you have a point of reference to where you're pressing and using your core against, and you know that if it's going to shift and move off of that, you have a tactile or physical cue that, oh, I don't feel as much pressure of my back onto that towel, my back onto the floor. It is very key for your brain to associate that and know if you shifted or moved your pelvis. Because one of the reasons why you have this is that we don't have a good awareness of what's happening in our lower core, our pelvis. That tactile or physical cue, touch cue, will give you that reference point. Then you're going to raise one leg off of the wall, put it back down, raise the other one off of the wall and put it back down. This should make your core have to tighten up more because all of a sudden it has load and then it doesn't, and it has load and then it doesn't. Because what that foot raising up does is it makes your hip flexor pull from your pelvis and your spine to raise up your foot. As you bring your body back away from the wall a little bit more, then now you have more load, and so it makes it harder. The key within this exercise is that you feel your core working for you, not your hip flexor and not your quad. It's because whenever you are doing this exercise, it's not an extreme load for your hip flexor unless your lower core and your pelvis are not being controlled with your muscles that are used there. If they are not being used, you need to scoot your butt closer to the wall and make it where you just slightly lift your foot off. And this may not be very much at all, but it's changing those movement patterns. It's changing how your brain functions with your body to help those two correlate together. Number two is working a similar type movement strategy. This is kind of like the step up for you. It's where you're actually in more of a bent over position. And so we're activating our core as a whole, not just the front side, but we're actually thinking about our core as a cylinder. We're bent over, we're using our glute on the stance side, our knee is slightly bent, and then we're driving our one leg up towards our chest and then back down. Up towards our chest and then back down. This similar thing is using our core as stability. You have to have a little bit more idea of what's happening to your trunk, your core, your pelvis. We don't want that to shift and move. We want that to be still and stable, just like we did on the first exercise. And then we're bringing our leg up and down. Now, we are using our hip flexor a little bit more in this situation, but we don't really want to feel it working as much. It can work some in this particular situation, but we want to make sure we feel our glutes on the stance side, no back tightness because we have control with our core, and we're feeling that hip flexor on our side that we're raising up and down. This starts to strengthen your hip flexor with the added movement patterns that we just learned in that marching exercise on our back. Number three goes into one of my favorite exercises because it works a lot of the other movement patterns and it really strengthens us as well. It's a mountain climber, but it's not a fast mountain climber, boom, 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 boom. It's a slow mountain climber. And so it's focused similarly on your core, your trunk control, and also your hip flexor. But again, this is not necessarily a hip flexor strengthening like the last exercise was. It's more like the first exercise, in that we're working our core even more because we're in more of a plank-like position. And so you're bending your knee and marching one leg up and then the other leg up. Mountain climber status. If you have issues with this one, that your core isn't strong enough, then move to an incline. This incline will then allow you to use your core. It again makes that tail tuck. You're supporting your back. You're not feeling stress through there, and you're marching one leg up and back down, up and back down. Keeping in mind that you're only raising your leg up so far as to your range of motion allows. Your hip can only bend so much. And so as you're doing this, don't try to raise your knee up all the way to your chest, rounding your back. We want to keep our pelvis and our back still. This is the support that you need for your mountain climber. It's that change and alternating back and forth, that change of load, and that our ability to make sure that our trunk stays still. Once you have that, add a band to your feet, and now you're actually strengthening and loading your core with this entire single exercise. As I said, exercise 1 was the first step, exercise 2, second step, exercise 3, moving forward into strengthening and making sure that you can actually load yourself and strengthen those hip flexors. I hope this was very eye-opening for you in regards to what you can be doing, how your core works with your hip flexors, and the fact that we need strength in your core, strength in your hip flexors, and that movement pattern will actually release some tightness. Check out my other videos on how to help with strengthening and mobility for your low back. There is a hip flexor stretch in there that I do really love. Subscribe to the channel if you want to hear more about this stuff, and let me know in the comments if something has worked really good for you to help with your hip flexors.